Welcome back. I'm Veronica Tash. I want to remind you to think critically here. I'm going pretty much right from the first video to the second. Can you say the same? Let's get to it because we want to watch Metatron's second video in this series. Was fascism left wing or right wing? Go from there. This one, 900, no, only 128K views, a lot fewer, 9,000 likes, but still needs to be debunked because it's more of the same.
La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia. Vincere!
Hello, noble ones! I've recently released a thought-provoking video titled Was Nazism Left Wing or Right Wing? This video, as I had expected, has created a little bit of a fuss, if you will. A ripple in the lake, a storm in the blue and red sky, I suppose. A dent in the matrix. The primary objective was to elucidate the inherent limitations of reductionist categorization within the political paradigm, and to propose a more nuanced framework for understanding complex historical phenomena. This way, encouraging the viewer to make their own mind and come to their own conclusion, applying critical thinking. A skill that I want to say we are slowly losing. Well, some people got it 100%, other people completely missed the point. And then you've got those that believe that, you shouldn't be allowed to speak if you disagree with them. Excellent Nazi tactic, by the way. On a positive note, instead, we've got two historians, these two gentlemen, that made response videos to my original video, and I think these...
Okay, now I do need to point out neither Mr. Terry nor Vlogging Through History are historians. They might be able to do that if they wanted, but they are high school history teachers. Or I think in case of Chris, he's a ex-high school history teacher. Historians do more than teach history, uh, and these two were not doing in-depth historical research to validate things. They were reacting to it using things they would say to high school history students. No hate on Mr. Terry there. Probably not on Chris either, but their approval isn't authoritative of its accuracy, especially in as this is a political science question, not a history question.
Were absolutely fantastic. I love it for a change when people are actually respectful in the way they make response videos to me instead of like, liar, liar, liar. So thank you so much, guys, for responding. Really, really appreciate it. You are awesome, and I will leave link to the response videos down below. New policy. If you are respectful in your responses, whether you agree with me or not, you get featured. No, not you. As for the original video, today's video's core tenet and focal point is to provide an opportunity for reflection on two things. One, the faulty nature of the question proper, as some things just don't jive with the elements we expect from the right and left dichotomy. Two, the inadequacy of 21st century politics in a 20th century context as a heuristic device. And I mean, this shouldn't really surprise us. At the end of the day, this binary model doesn't really leave much space for nuance, does it? As stated in the original video, I still suggest that the fundamentals of this question, was it left-wing or right-wing, is in fact incongruent, particularly when viewed from a 21st century perspective, and often an American one at that, when the topic of discussion is indeed 20th century European extreme political regimes. We expose, therefore, the contingencies of time and space that make the framing of the question somewhat invalid or not apt for delineating and accurately describing these 20th century's historical parties.
As discussed prior in the other reaction, that was complete nonsense. Left and right are timeless concepts, not temporally and spatially bound concepts.
Moreover, the video offered a third option by describing these regimes as totalitarian dictatorships instead, rather than trying to fit them in a left or right box. We could successfully shift the focus to the regime's operational mechanics, ideological underpinnings, and sociopolitical impacts. Just like I mentioned on the first video when talking about the word or the slur Nazi, today we're talking about the word fascist. But once again, when this is used as a way to just attack or insult the other side or the opposite of your political persuasion, even though that's very common, personally, I find it to be a rather useless and unproductive exercise.
Now, he says this in a time when fascism grips the United States, the president economically punishes private and state institutions that differ from him, declares scientific and legal conclusions via executive order, says the courts cannot constrain him, and Congress has a big, beautiful bill that neuters courts' ability to do so. We are living in fascism, and did Metatron's video help you realize that?
I ask, is it useful critically to use this language at this point in time? And besides, let's also remember that just calling someone a fascist doesn't make it so. Discourse, rather than insults, in my opinion, are in fact the best dynamic. Well, be that.
There are many fascists out there, consciously and not. I was calling out signs in 2016 while Trump was still running. But at this point, any scholar remotely in the area will tell you it's fascism.
As it may, after I finish with this video and I present all of my information, if you still want to use fascist as a way to insult your political opponents, I mean, freedom of speech. But at least you'll know exactly what you're saying. Because at the end of the day, we all know fascism is bad. Great. But what does it mean to be a fascist?
Watch him define it incorrectly.
What is fascism? Now, do you remember the section of my original video where I demonstrated how historically the Nazis, the fascist, and communist regimes took away your freedom of speech as a result of their, authoritarian struggle for utter control of the masses? Well, in light of that, today I ask the question, was fascism left-wing or right-wing? I ask it because the very suppression of such inquiries mirrors, ironically, the very totalitarian practices of fascist regimes.
Is to note that Nazism is universally accepted as a form of fascism. As Terence Ball and Richard Dagger put it, Nazism equals fascism plus racism.
And to all those that tell me, don't you dare speaking about this again, very fascist of you. Gentile and Mussolini would be proud. I ask it because you and I are free to inquire with dignity. Therefore, I don't just ask this question today, but I also ask you to continue to ask it so that this may never happen again. Was fascism left-wing or right-wing? Historically, the Partito Nazionale Fascista's government of Italy from 1922 to 1943 is traditionally demarcated into three evolutionary phases: the seizure of power, consolidation, and expansion, the latter often regarded as the regime's most oppressive period. This tripartite periodization offers a framework for analyzing the regime's progression and impact. Benito Mussolini, commonly referred to as Il Duce, emerges as a pivotal figure in the 20th century European history. His ascension to power in Italy and the subsequent establishment of a fascist state had profound implications not only for Italy, but for the global political landscape. Born in 1883 in the provincial town of Predappio, Mussolini's formative years were characterized by socialist inclinations mixed with nationalistic sentiments. The March on Rome in October 1922 marked a critical juncture in Mussolini's rise to power. This orchestrated show of force effectively intimidated the Italian government, and King Vittorio Emanuele III, faced with the prospects of civil war, capitulated, appointing Mussolini as prime minister. This event heralded the inception of fascist rule in Italy, a regime that would endure until 1943.
Okay, there are questions that history can answer. That's all fact that he just said. It's what happened. No supposition outside the realm of his team of experts. What he didn't do is define fascism. I misspoke before. I said watch him do it incorrectly. He didn't even define it. Fascism is a conjunction of three counter-enlightenment movements: nationalism, irrationalism, and elitism. These are all rejections of part of the liberal enlightenment that had power in the 19th century. Fascism was a change in rejecting all three and moving more fully back to absolutist monarchy of the 16th through 18th centuries. Some historians break it down into more things, but they are all things that can fit into these three categories. It's not useful to get too specific because then the actual framework breaks down. For example, Britannica will list opposition to Marxism. If in the future a society has fully rejected Marx, so a leader doesn't feel the need to address Marxism, is it not fascist until he does, even if everything else is marked? That's why a broad categorization is preferable.
But now let's start focusing a little bit more on the minds of those persons that created it. In this case, the father of its theory, Giovanni Gentile, and the executing arm. Mussolini could easily be described as a demagogue. So, what is a demagogue? Well, in this context, this word refers to people who practice the idea of gaining support through the exploitation of popular desires and prejudices rather than through rational argument or moral principle. Mussolini's rhetorical strategy was predicated on arousing the emotions of the populace, often at the expense of logical coherence or ethical considerations. In this sense, one could say that Mussolini's political success was his embodiment of the demagogue archetype.
This is irrationalism. Traditionally, irrationalism was more Nietzschean, a denial that truth exists or that it can be known. However, fascist irrationalism was a bit unique, called operational irrationalism. Instead of denying access to truth, it sought to subvert logic and reason. Hitler decried the lying press, i.e., fake news, make people distrust other sources of information by attacking the credibility of academia or other areas where experts may be authoritative, shut down freedom of the press, repeat lies until they're accepted. You control the access to information, then you appeal to emotion, not reason. You scapegoat to create an existential threat to your in group. Look at how the Trump administration speaks of trans people, immigrants, Jewish students opposing genocide in Gaza, etc. And I can move on from there.
The approach employed by Mussolini can be characterized by 1. Emotional manipulation, 2. Simplification of complex issues, 3. Scapegoating, in other words, identifying and vilifying perceived enemies of the state or society, and 4. Charismatic performance. And when it comes to this last one, look at this. We're going to check an original clip now. I mean, I've already shown a few, but check this one out. Look at the body language.
Aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
You see, according to Gentile, one of the main and prominent thinkers that are behind the concept of fascism, there is no distinction between the private interest and the public interest, and everything should be subordinate to the state.
That would be the fascist form of nationalism, where the nation is everything and the individual, at least the masses, exists only to empower the nation. Mussolini, Hitler, Hussein, their private interests, their private interests don't matter. It's an idea that you were their property.
Let's now do a little bit of preliminary exploratory research. If we open the Wikipedia page on fascism, you'll notice that it says that fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, ultranationalistic political ideology and movement. Now, that is because in Europe, conventionally, that's the way it's taught. In Europe, being the key. This is normally based on the fact that fascism opposed communism, and communism being at the extreme end of the left-wing paradigm, whenever we want to look at it this way, fascists being in strong opposition against specifically Bolshevik communists, then of course it creates a kind of a neat dichotomy. Not to mention that there are parties in Italy that do derive from the ashes of the fascist movement, and they all, in this case, right-wing. Although, of course,
or that the National Socialist Party was the furthest right of a right-wing coalition, and when they caved to allow Hitler to be chancellor, it was justified that actually having to rule would moderate him. By any rational metric, they were far right.
they're not as extreme. I mean, obviously. But when we start looking at this from the American perspective, then things change, and the situation
The American perspective. Let's see more superficial connections.
becomes more nuanced, if you will. Fascism was big on public health care, the emergence of health policies with distinct fascist characteristics.
As noted in the other video, national healthcare was pre-existing by more than 50 years for Germany. Hitler cut the care for scapegoats and had programs to get Aryan Germans to reproduce more and be more fit for military service. They had anti-smoking and anti-alcohol programs that stood out. This is really inaccurate overall. It's not much focus on healthcare. Italy didn't have national healthcare until 1978, but Mussolini focused on fighting malaria that affected his troops. Metatron is free to prove me wrong there. I'm no scholar on Italian healthcare history. He was born there, grew up there, though we are told by conspiracy theorists he doesn't actually speak Italian. Certainly, the intention was not one of wanting a better life for Italians by assuring the poor access to health, which is a left-wing ideal. But conquest and improving productivity for Mussolini and his oligarchs. It's superficial at best, you muppet.
Which occurred in the late 1920s. When we look at the consolidated structure of the fascist healthcare state, we'll see that it can be divided into three main constituents. The new welfare-based, called enti pubblici, the traditional ministerial bureaucracies, and local services. And in this case, when it comes to the focus or even fixation, one could say, on public health, the reason was, generally speaking, to foster population growth. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with fostering population growth, but when you're under this, it does have to be connected to then exploitation, extreme taxation, military expansionism, and in general, increasing the number of subjects. And this expanded in 1925 with the Italian fascist regime created the Opera Nazionale Maternità ed Infanzia, which combined social welfare with the realization of the regime's demographic aims. So, public healthcare, big government, socialist roots, as I'll discuss on section 8, all of this makes it sound left-wing from an American.
He constantly says not to apply modern ideas to the past. But we can and should apply the American perspective to 1930s Germany and Italy. It's really weird to hear him say this beyond what's wrong with it. It's like a rabbi and an imam getting together to host a pig roast for their congregations. Steak night at the Hindu temple. It's really out of character for Metatron. I don't know why he is trying this angle.
Perspective. But before we jump into the actual policies, let me swap the colors. And literally, for all the American friends of the platform, this is so confusing. Like, I get it that you wanted to use blue and red because those are the colors you got on your flag. Beautiful flag, by the way. But then again, red everywhere else is the commies. Anyways, you do you, whatever color you like.
Commies still use red. And Lincoln and Marx had a mutual admiration. The parties did flip over time. I don't think that socialism was at all a big movement in the 1860s. It really started gaining traction maybe late 1870s is when it started. with unionism, which was the best socialist structure you could have under a capitalist economy, essentially. Unions are socialists, and they are very, very good and important and vital to improving the lives of the working class. They're what created the middle class. It's not really a middle class, still just working class people, but people are economically better off, and the capitalists try to make it sound like that's a class when it's not. Classes have to do with your relation to the means of production, and the relation to the means of production didn't change for this middle class. The actual middle classes would be people like petite bourgeoisie, where they're equally in ownership and labor. So you're looking at your small mom and pop shops where they don't have any employees. They're both owning and owning, managing, and actually working it. Lawyers often are that. Doctors are often that, where they're in business for themselves. Um, Managers are considered that because they're managing, but also doing some sort of work. They're in this in between the ruling class and the lower class. Uh, in this case, being the working class. But anyways, what created that economic middle was unions. That really started picking up there. So there wasn't much need for red to be standing for socialism or communism at that point. Um, Socialism wasn't unheard of. Like I said, Lincoln and Marx had a mutual admiration. Marx strongly supported Lincoln. Lincoln at least spoke favorably about Marx, but didn't really take Marx's ideas. He did believe in the idea of creating people when they have new lands open to the West, which we won't get into the whole disenfranchised American Indians there. But the idea was still that these people would be able to be self-sufficient, that they'd be that middle class where they both own um, and they work. It's not how things actually worked out there, but that was what Lincoln favored. And that is very much what socialism is about too. It's about getting people where, even though you're working in this communal thing, because you have collective ownership and control, you're both managing and operating.
What do I know? We will focus on the theoretical fundamentals of fascism, which is one thing, and then the practical expressions of fascism, such as, for example, party organization, system of education, legislation, which then, of course, irreversibly bled into the education system proper. After all, as anyone who has ever studied history can tell you, nothing in politics happens by accident. Let's talk about the nature of fascism.
Combattenti di terra, di mare, dell'aria, camicie nere della rivoluzione e delle legioni.
I personally reckon that fascism should absolutely be studied deeply, as its impact on European history was, one could say, incalculable. However, even though up to a certain extent we all know what fascism is, in reality, when you really think about it at an ontological level, its nature, its taxonomic and definitional characteristics may be elusive after all. I will strongly justify this statement later on this video. Sure, fascism did have its academic theoreticians, but then again, someone can also argue that fascism has no intellectual basis. It is, in fact, a baseless ideology. Let me defend that. When examining Benito Mussolini's boastful balcony speeches, someone could say, well, in the words of Roger Scruton, that they are in fact an amalgam of disparate conceptions, which present a complex tapestry of political thought. This highlights the heterogeneous nature of fascist ideology, which is an ideology of opportunity, but in a negative sense. This poses significant challenges for scholars attempting to formulate a unified theory of fascism. Professor Herney Turner Jr. astutely observes the recurrent pattern in fascism studies. open quotes. Anyone who reads many studies on fascism as a multinational phenomenon cannot but be struck by the frequency with which writers who begin by assuming they are dealing with a unitary phenomenon end up with several more or less discrete subcategories. Regardless of what criteria are applied, it seems very difficult to keep fascism from fragmenting.
As I said, you need broad categorization, not very, very specific things. Not everything's going to perfectly line up as Metatron seems to think people think. Broad categorization. Those three movements are perfect for defining fascism.
Close quotes. Turner's observations underscores a fundamental epistemological problem in the study of fascism, the tension between the desire for a comprehensive, universally applicable definition and the historical reality of diverse fascist movements with distinct national characteristics. This tension has led to a proliferation of subcategories and typologies within fascism studies, each attempting to capture the nuances of specific historical manifestations. And it is this very persistent fragmentation of fascism when placed under actual rigorous analytical scrutiny that presents us with a question. What defines fascism? Well, Turner posits a provocative hypothesis. He says, open quotes, that fascism as a generic concept has no validity and is without value for serious analytical purposes.
Turner is wrong. It is a bad ideology, but it seems to come up when capitalism is failing as an alternative to socialism, which is favored by economic oligarchies or oligarchs. The circumstances around the rise of fascism is quite good for analysis. It now Turner may be speaking more specific to the the concept. I guess you could say no validity, but even there, I think it's more of a return to absolutist monarchy. It is moving far, far right as far as we can go to reinstate that old absolutist monarchy of Renaissance Europe.
Close quotes. This assertion should lead us to the reevaluation of our basic assumptions about fascism. The nature of fascism in its fundamental values is in fact an old school debate. So to help us define it, we should look not only at the minds that created it, but also, if not most importantly, the geopolitical situation and societal conditions that began its gestation in the early 1900s. Fascism intuition is a system of ideas evolving within the framework of a historical moment, cemented due to specific historical conditions that facilitated a intellectual conversion towards the unitary conceptualization of dictatorial regimes. Just like any other ideology, fascism is a construct of the mind. So understanding the sort of societal pressures under which the mind created the concept of fascism is paramount to our investigation. Fascist ideology was fortified through the employment of fear-mongering tactics and manipulative strategies, adeptly exploiting the anxieties, discontents, and prejudices prevalent in a society experiencing an economic crisis. It is crucial to note that the establishment of the regime's primary institution coincided with the zenith of the Great Depression that occurred in Italia in 1932. So, if you forget anything I say on this video, remember this. Fascism doesn't happen in a happy, thriving, and successful society. Therefore, here is my first definitional trait. Fascism is a symptom of societal collapse.
Absolutely agree. Bravo to Metatron for getting this. I don't think he would agree that it is when the stratification of society by income and wealth inequality make it impossible to rationally defend the current state of capitalism that leads to oligarchs to overthrow any sense of democracy to consolidate power against a rising true left. But yes, it is a collapse of the pre-existing society. Oligarchs don't like it when you try to chain capitalism, hence the Wall Street putsch that tried to overthrow FDR. If you're trying to look that up, PUTSCH, putsch.
The fascist ideology stands in diametric opposition to the principles of individualism, and it categorically rejects the notions of competitive elections. It manifests a unitary, autocratic regime that systematically and often violently suppressed any forms of perceived political dissent. The fascist state's modus operandi is characterized by ruthless extirpation of pluralistic political expression and the imposition of a monolithic power structure, the one-party system. So, at any point, if you see even a modern political party that tries to push the idea of a one-party system, that you can absolutely call fascist on any side of the political spectrum, because at the end of the day,
that is something they do, but is not unique to fascists. It is not enough to meet one characteristic. Socialism necessitates democracy, but not all democracies are socialist. This is in affirming the consequent fallacy.
Extreme starch. It's the horseshoe effect. And talking about individualism, in Benito,
there is no horseshoe effect. Horseshoe theory has been thoroughly debunked. It is a weak observation of superficial similarities from centrists.
Mussolini's own words, Benito Mussolini himself publicly stated that fascism is anti-individualistic and accepts the individual only in as far as the interests coincide with those of the state. So
once again, individualism is variant and began on the relative left against monarchy. It began being opposed by an oppressive monarch who felt a divine right to tell people what to believe, what to say, what to do, being a mere statement that one need only, being a mere statement that one need only care about themselves is a superficial similarity. These are two different kinds of individualism. It's not one thing. And it's not individualism is not just simply a right-wing concept. It's a intermediary liberal concept. Partway through the spectrum that you get this big sense of, I have complete freedom, but fuck everyone else. I don't have to worry about how it affects you, how it affects them. Things work their way out, deal with it. When you're looking at, socialist form of collectivism, it doesn't deny the individual. It just ensures that everybody has everybody's taken care of. Everybody's getting their full development, that we're getting as, spreading out the ability to meet what Marx called your species man, natural man needs, which is your basic, food, water, shelter, sex stuff, to your species man needs, which includes art, theater, philosophy, music, love, fine cuisine, not just food, but something that's enjoyable. That you're spreading that out, and ultimately, once you reach that higher stage, or as Lenin put it, that's what you're going to call communism. Because Lenin did make socialism the lower stage, communism the higher stage, and it's easier to talk about that way. I like that part about Lenin. But communism, everybody gets to meet all those needs. Everybody gets all their needs met, and that requires actual automation of everything. We're not there. We're being threatened by it because we're not going to be beneficiaries of this AI revolution as it stands. But that you need something much stronger than what they have. They have crap, and they're going to fall on their faces eventually trying it, because it's not sentient. Yeah, I could do a great video on that eventually. I probably should, but I want to get some more basic stuff done before I go into my own little theories there.
In other words, the fundamental trait that I'm trying to present today as we try to define what fascism is, it's its innate ideological fluidity, or hybridity, if you will, which is what allows it to connect easily with extremist ideas, even when their core principles are different.
Then you failed, Metatron. You did not show that. You failed to understand individualism in depth as it applies to arguments from the right and left of liberalism. Like the horseshoe theorist, you saw an attack on self determination from the right and an attack on greed, claiming you owe the rest of society for creating the ability for you to be rich, a sentiment shared by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations from the left, and said that they were the same.
Fascism is characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized authority, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, usually belief in a natural social hierarchy, subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation, a strong regimentation of society, big government, and control of the economy. Now, it's
Belief in natural social hierarchy. That meshes with the left's anti hierarchy, classless society of equality. How? I mean, it just doesn't fit. How is. Let's go try to stop
big
it.
government and control of.
You see all this stuff, and you're looking right there, saying this very clear. That's very, very right wing. Just simply saying, oh, there's big government control of the economy. Very, very right wing things are able to have big government control of the economy. Look at the nature of the government. Look at the nature of the control. You're just using things out of context to make it seem like there's left wing elements when there aren't. There's a big, huge difference between a king being the big government and a body of the people being the government. That's big. Big difference.
The economy. Now, it's important to underline, however, that historically the control of the economy.
Oh, I almost forgot. By the way, that's elitism that we were discussing. That's that third requirement for fascism, that natural social hierarchy.
Did not happen, at least in the very beginning. It's a little bit of a late stage version of fascism. What I mean by that is that initial fascist policies and positions when it comes to the economy were based on two major elements. Early fascist government was a massive proponent of privatization, and it pushed the idea of lowering taxes. Of course, to a modern American, both of these ideas would sound right-wing. With that being said,
Those are both right wing. They don't sound right wing, just they are right wing. Privatization may be a left wing if you're appropriating them from a monarch. And you say, oh, the monarch owns the steel mines. Well, we're going to give it to private individuals. In a sense, that's privatization, but would you really call it privatization then? That's the only way that it's at all marginally left is if you're taking it from a monarch. But privatization, as they're describing, taking it from a collective, more democratic government, is very, very, that's a right wing move all the way.
let's have a look at late iteration fascism. The economy that characterized fascism after Mussolini had consolidated power was what we could call a dirigist economy, which is a market economy in which the state plays a strong directive role through economic interventionism and policies. All of this with the principal goal of achieving what is called autarky, or national.
Okay, and kings regulate markets, as do capitalist states. In fact, regulation is what creates any market at all. The market does not exist without state regulation. It creates property rights. In fact, in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith differentiated between regulation on behalf of capital and regulation on behalf of workers. Let me read it. Did I skip through some things? Oh, I think I did, but we'll get back to it. You can see right here in Wealth of Nations, this will be chapter 10. Obviously, it's chapter 11, starting right below, the end of chapter 10. Whenever the legislature attempts to regulate the differences between masters and their workmen, its counselors are always the masters. When the regulation, therefore, is in favor of the workmen, it is always just and equitable. But it is sometimes otherwise when in favor of the masters. This is, in America, right-wing hero, Adam Smith, saying things that they don't actually realize. He said, now what we are looking at here that I skipped over, there is a good article here, Are Tyrants Good for Your Health? That's talking about what Mussolini actually did, and it's just working on the malaria stuff. That's what you can find that is big. If there's something else that something that's not discussed here, where it's just Mussolini trying to do things for the sake of conquering northern Africa, then let's see Metatron actually show what this big healthcare craze is that is somehow left wing for Mussolini. It's not like, I know it seems weird because we have Donald Trump who seems to be anti-health altogether, but normally even fascists, everybody cares about health of the people to some extent. They may not want to pay for the poor to be healthy, but they have some sort of health program. There's nothing super left wing about the Italian fascist healthcare program, let alone the Nazi Germany healthcare program. The other thing that we skipped, and it's paywall and blocks it, but who was a fan of Marx? Not AOC, blocked by the little window here. You can't scroll up and down to see. Abraham Lincoln. So that was back before Washington Post was always paywall. You can see where it's talking about how Lincoln has that relationship with Abraham, with Marx, which isn't like, it's not they have a deep relationship. Abraham Lincoln wasn't a Marxist, but they did have some sort of mutual admiration.
Economic self-sufficiency, a sort of state-directed capitalism which had some common elements with socialism that normally you call corporatism. This gave the
Corporatism is about recreating feudalism, not socialism. And so we're going to go jump over here. Yeah, just want to make sure I'm not going crazy. This is all about corporatism, and it talks about where it comes from. Theory and practice of organizing society into corporations subordinate to the state. According to corporatist theory, workers, employers will be organizing industrial and professional corporations serving as organs of political representation and controlling to a large extent the persons and activities within their jurisdiction. Boom, boom, boom. And as it was actually instituted by Mussolini, it was more about his will rather than just for the economic groups themselves. But the corporate idea goes back to colonial Puritan New England. Its theoretical expression wasn't expressed after the French Revolution. And it starts about Adam Mueller, the court philosopher for Prince Clemens Metternich. I don't know. I don't speak German, so I think that's correct. Anyways, he was attacking French egalitarianism and laissez-faire economics of Adam Smith, and from Britannica, were vigorous attempts to find a modern justification for traditional institutions, and led him to conceive a modernized Standesstaat, which might claim sovereignty and divine right because it would be organized to regulate production and coordinate class interests. Although roughly equivalent to the feudal classes, its stand, or estates, were to operate as guilds or corporations, each controlling a specific function of social life, etc., etc. This is, even though some of it was used to create the idea of guild socialism, this was not socialist. It was you're working with the employers and the workers are all together as this thing, and the employers are going to be calling the shots. And if you ever played Europa Universalis 4, they have the estates. I mean, that's essentially what this is describing. Of course, there's much more than 3 of them. But keep in mind that in the Italian context, they had the that it wasn't even that. It just defaulted back to Mussolini's will, more of a monarchy as opposed to an oligarchy. And when we look at the Nazi Germany, go back to Pollock, these rights have been transferred to the ruling groups as a whole. It goes to the oligarchs. This is not socialism. Metatron doesn't understand what constitutes socialism. He hasn't gone into, he doesn't see the basic idea of worker collective ownership and control, and just reads off of perversions of socialist thought, such as what you saw with Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, what you saw with Mao in China, and quite frankly, see a lot of that. I don't know if there has been a proper attempt at a socialist state. You did have the social democracies of Northern Europe that started working towards socialism, but they sort of, as it was criticized, their critics originally said this was going to happen. You lose revolutionary fervor, and they became welfare liberals. They're doing the same things, basically, but they're welfare liberals just trying to chain in capitalism rather than actually build socialism brick by brick. But yeah, that's not socialism. Whether or not you think socialism will work, that's not what socialism is. And pretending it is I think in the case of Metatron, foolish, or for others, it's intellectually dishonest. You want to look at what it does as well as what it intends to be. But when you go look at what Marx says about what's needed, and what even Lenin and Trotsky admitted, yes, Marx says we need this level of development. We're not ready for it. We're going to have state capitalism. Just because Stalin calls it socialism in one country several years later, possibly in part to try to keep from being invaded, because the Trotskyist and Leninist internationalism was scaring people because they were trying to foment a revolution in the West. But it was a absolute betrayal of any attempt to create socialism. It's not something it's fair to say this is what socialism is in practice. That's something that people who really, really hate socialism say, and which Stalinists say, and not people in between.
Just the ability to confiscate.
But now when we describe the feudal structure that it's talked about, it doesn't sound very left-wing now, does it?
Assets at their will while controlling the vast majority of Italy's credit generated by the workforce. Yet now it doesn't sound right-wing anymore, does it? So why was there this fundamental change between early fascism and late fascism? Well, most likely the early fascist positions on economy and all of that privatization when it comes to, for example, putting an end to the state control of life insurance, just to give you one, was a way to gain the votes and support of the bourgeoisie. And in fact, at the very beginning, when fascists raised to power, the Minister of Finance and Economy was a centrist, Alberto De Stefani, who was a massive supporter of free market, an element in common with modern-day American right-wing. That's until 1925, which is when Mussolini fired him. And what about that promise of lowering taxes? Oh, at first they did, but towards the end of the regime, what Mussolini ended up doing was raising taxes. And I mean a lot. And this, in a way, shouldn't really surprise us because, as we will see, Mussolini's roots were socialists in the sense that this idea of collective sacrifice through taxation in order to give more power and more capability to the state was something that he had believed for over 14 years. So even though...
No. Mussolini began as a socialist. It was I was probably a Republican when I was 13, supporting their policies, but luckily I wised up at 14, looking into democratic socialism in early 1997. At 15, I joined the Socialist Party USA. Mussolini got kicked out of his Socialist Party. Donald Trump was once a Democrat. It's not... Just because somebody was something at one point doesn't mean that they still are. Mussolini almost immediately switched away from class analysis when he was booted from the Italian Socialist Party, which suggests an opportunist. His subsequent actions were very anti-socialist. Taxation also isn't left-wing. Kings laid taxes. Roman emperors taxed people. What matters is what taxes are spent on. Imperialist expansion into Northern Africa, right wing. A new vacation palace for the king, right wing. Social welfare for the poor, left wing. Free education, left wing. It goes deeper than just simply taxes are left wing. I mean, you really aren't understanding the history of political structures to think that taxation is automatically left wing. And when you look at what the fascists spend their money on, it is, once again, these people are their property. They exist for making them money, being productive so that they can have wealth at the top. It is a feudal structure. It is not a socialist structure. And it is very superficial to create that. It means that you haven't really looked into these things and thought about them deeply at all. And there's not a single person on his team who would have been trained to do that kind of thing. When you're looking at, politics, they're going to look deeply into historical issues, but trying to look at looking deeply when you're dealing with actual political forces, what is left wing, what is right wing, that's not something that they are trained at all to do. This, and so I guarantee you, when they're looking at this, they're not really considering those questions. They're saying, let Metatron go handle that part. Let's make sure we have all the facts lined up about what historically happened. And they did fail on the healthcare stuff because it is way overblown, along with the social welfare stuff. But there is a whole lot of context that you are not getting from people trained in history that is going to be missed here.
After being expulsed from the Socialist Party, as we will see in a second, and having this massive shift in political allegiances, his core tenets when it came to economy, as we see after he consolidated power, were still clearly rooted in socialism. That's where the situation starts to become confusing.
No, this is you not knowing political science. In a sense, it is you not knowing the history of corporatism or taxation, it's understandable for a layman, but you put yourself forward as an expert with a team of experts, none of which have expertise in the relevant area of these videos. It is a big deal, Metatron. You have to, these aren't videos that you started saying, this is all just my opinion. You do videos like that where you say, yeah, this is out of my area. You're essentially de facto purporting this as being within your area, and it isn't. And so you're speaking as if you are an expert when you're not, with the actual question being asked. You're an linguist. Yeah, you got your doctorate there. You know a shitload of languages. You are good at translation. I am sure of it. That's why you got a doctorate there. History, it is something that you probably read about a lot when you are translating stuff. It is a passion of yours. You have self-educated enough that you are, if not an expert, you are you could say you're very well educated on history, and you got a team of definite experts on there. That's in your team. Issues like this is not your expertise. It's not your team's expertise. You need to know what is your expertise and what's not.
Because you see, even though this idea of big state, big government controlling the economy and having a lot to say when it comes to people's everyday lives clearly makes it sound left-wing from an American modern perspective, but then again, how much of the GDP did the fascists spend for the strengthening of the military and for law and order? Both concepts that tend to be quite right-wing today, at least in modern-day America. Because, I mean, what about the military strength and spending budgets of the Soviets, of the USSR? You see why this is confusing? Another aspect that we can discuss is the idea of collective identity within the concept of the state. So the idea of the ultra-nationalism of fascists of 1940s Italy. Now, given, once again, if we want to look at this from the spectrum of modern American politics, then if we were to look at the average liberal versus the average conservative, then the ultra-nationalistic types tend to be found more often on the right wing of the spectrum. With that being said, what happens if we look at modern day China?
Mao never read a major work of Marx because he was monolingual, and none were translated into any Chinese dialect during his lifetime, or at least not when he was having the revolution setting things up. Lenin established state capitalism. Stalin called it socialism in one country, and Mao used that to make a third world nationalist revolution that used farming communes. He thought that was socialist, but it was not. And I do want to stress that when you talk about socialism, you talk about that lower stage there that Marx and Engels spoke of. It is not equal for everybody. It is you get according to your production. Communes are not that, and this is something that people have to be ideologically committed to work. You have a commune. It's not communism; it's communalism, is what I like to call it. China threw away Mao in the 1970s when the Soviets stopped backing them, officially. They weren't giving them, economic aid and whatnot. Socialism doesn't have corporate sweatshops and corporate gang wars, as at least in the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, there were stories about corporate gang wars between Chinese corporations going at it in the streets. That is not socialism. That is very far from it. China is kind of fascist. It is also a leading capitalist imperialist power that attacks student Marxists. Just because it is led by a communist party nominally does not make it so. Remember the good point you made in the first video? That one about how we don't just go by names? Same thing with China. Just because they call themselves communists doesn't make them communists. You have to look at what communism actually is. And you're not doing that just through history. You have to look at the actual theory. And it is a lot to look at. It is something that you are either really into or that you actually study in depth. Um, most people call them socialists and communists don't know a whole bunch of detail on that theory. They know enough to get by. They know what they like. There are still a high proportion who do go into that deeply. There's a lot of people who have doctorates where they very specifically studied socialist stuff. They studied the Soviet Union in detail, or they studied Marxist theory in detail, or whatever it is that they really want to do. There's a whole lot of that, but most of them, no, they're not. Most aren't that into it. Myself, I am more on. I was really into it. I looked into it a lot. I have not formally studied a whole lot of Marx in detail. I focused more on people like uh, Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, and so on, our early modern people. I looked a lot at things that they learned in more modern times. Um, and I do want to eventually get more detailed into Marxist thought, but this is stuff that I was able to pick up by being really into it and reading bits here and there, and undergrad philosophy class on Marx, of course, that helped create a proper framework for it. Junior is a 3000 level. I took my very first semester of college back in 2000. But yeah, it's not, you can't just say China is communist because it calls itself communist. You have to go into it. That's why you want to actually know a bit more before you go into this stuff. And you're going into it as a historian, which is not the type of person who's able to judge these type of things, to be able to speak competently on these sorts of things. Historians, are going to know a whole lot more than me. Somebody specializes in China about specific events of the Chinese Revolution, and Mao did this specific thing at this specific time. This is when the Cultural Revolution began and ended, and whatnot. But when it comes to theory, I'm the type of person you look to, and there's people like me who can tell you a whole lot more detail because they study this type of thing specifically. I'm sure there's people who did their doctorates on the philosophy of Maoism and all that stuff. But yeah, this is not communist. That's not what China is. They are capitalist and they are imperialist. And I would say most likely they are fascist. They are definitely nationalists, Han nationalists specifically. This isn't all Chinese people. This is just the Han people that they're nationalists for. Everyone else is, second class at best. I don't know for sure about Cantonese people. Maybe they're, somewhere a little bit above what you would call second class. Um, you do have that, nationalism. You do have the hierarchy, the very clear hierarchy. You do, down to the capitalism and the party structure is very hierarchical. Um, I'm not 100% sure on irrationalism for them. That's the only place I'm stopping short of straight up calling them fascist. Is I'm not versed enough to say whether they were or whether they are irrationalists in how they handle things. They are very hostile to freedom of speech and things like that, but that's not quite enough to be irrationalist. And I don't pay that close attention to how Chinese, premiers talk to their people and whatnot.
That is very nationalistic, but it's communist. As a last point, when it comes to the economy, there is one thing that I would like to say that I did forget to mention on my original video on Nazism when discussing the economic policies, and that is the idea of a wartime economy, which is of course different from a peacetime economy. Now, this is something that was one of the elements of discussion brought up by this historian, and since he brought it up very eloquently, we're going to listen to him now.
Wartime
There's Chris.
is a completely different animal compared to peacetime. You know, people like to point at Abraham Lincoln and say what a tyrant he was because of certain things he did in times of war, in times of rebellion. Would he have done those things in times of peace, which is what really, to me, determines what kind of a leader you are.
Thank you very much, Blogging Through History. A very fair point. Another thing that is, common knowledge, but perhaps not everyone is aware of, is the fact that Mussolini, before becoming the Duce, and even before just starting the fascist movement, he was a socialist, in the sense that for 14 years he was a member, and in fact a very active member, of the Italian Socialist Party. The thing is that the Socialist Party during World War I was advocating for neutrality during the war, whereby Mussolini was already at that time a war agitator, so he completely disagreed, we could say, with the remaining members of the party, which led to his expulsion, something that clearly he wasn't very happy about. This is where we see historically a massive shift when it comes to Mussolini as a socialist himself, and then a pro-socialist, all the way up to considering the socialists as his enemies, and in fact starting hating the communists. So once again, this can be confusing, because when you hear socialist, left wing, and then you hear, but he hates the commies, well, that sounds right wing. This once again connects to the opportunistic nature of fascism as a doctrine, if you will, to accumulate power. That is really the focal point, whether it be Nazism, whether it be communism, whether it be fascism. That is the focal point of dictatorships, is that their main objective, since they are totalitarian regimes, is to accumulate power by any means necessary. And these sort of leaders, these generational personae in a negative sense, are willing to say anything, muster any flag, wear any color, as long as it takes and helps them focus and concentrate power. That's why, as I say, and as I said in the previous video, and as I will continue to say on this series, left-wing, right-wing, particularly from a modern perspective, isn't the best way to classify these historical regimes. In fact, all of them. They are dictatorial regimes. They are totalitarian dictatorships. It should have its own box and nomenclature. Regardless, this is what historically leads Mussolini's shift, and when he starts the fascist movement called Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, and the rest is history.
Let me even add here that after World War One, Hitler briefly considered joining a communist revolutionary movement in Bavaria. That fell before he could join. Once again, opportunism. You were talking right there. These, you're talking about all the opportunism of fascism. It's the leaders themselves, I would say, who are opportunists. They're looking for power wherever they can get it. Mussolini was big. The editor of the paper, very prominent, very, working hard at it, not because he believed it, but because he saw it as a path to power. And you see that everywhere. Top of the Democratic Party, Republican Party, these are people who are opportunists who look for how they're going to get there. Within socialist movements, I've been on the National Committee of Socialist Party USA for about a decade. And during that time, I saw many opportunists enter. They were looking for power. And when it was clear they weren't going to get the power, they leave. And sometimes they would decide, well, that means I'm going to trash the party on the way out, try to grab people to move to a new party where I can get power and build my base by having followers type thing. Opportunism is something that happens all around. And what we're really looking at is the right will give them power. I'm not saying left will never do it, but in these particular cases, it was the right that finally gave them power, and very uncritically. Now, I don't recall the specifics of the Hitler thing. It was in Benjamin Carter Hett's Death of Democracy. It's a book I lent to somebody, and I forgot who I lent it to, so I don't even know who to ask it back from, but he covered how after World War One, Hitler tried, was considering joining this communist revolutionary movement where he could, sort of just take power for himself. And failing that, he went, found himself a different political party and moved his way in, altered them, and made them into what he wanted them to be. And that's where we get, the Nazi Party. It is ultimately opportunism on their part. Don't put too much in to the fact that Mussolini was once a prominent socialist. That is not where the ideology comes from. And you are giving him too much credit as a socialist that he was earnest when he was putting forth that stuff. That was not what Mussolini actually was about.
All right, but what about Benito Mussolini's fixation with the past and recreating and bringing back the strength of ancient Rome, for example, so the past glory? This, of course, has to do with the type of propaganda that Mussolini was using. Fascism occurred during a time of crisis. So, of course, if people or the citizen are experiencing crisis and you present to them, well, look at the past, things were better back then clearly that's going to work on a lot of them. And that's something that we see happening since the times of the Roman Republic. And
it is very, very pronounced in fascism specifically because it's part of the irrationalism. You're creating this glorious past and a myth, very specifically a victim myth. You go look at Nazi Germany. We were doing great till the Jews sold us out, blah, blah, blah. And that's the Nazi victim myth. For Italy, it was a lot that we fought in the war, but we didn't get our part of the war reparations. It's a weaker victim myth, but very strong on we were once great. We are Rome. We're going to reconquer our territories. When you're looking at, look at America today, MAGA. These are people who they're being told you were, once powerful white heterosexual cisgender men, blah, blah, blah. And look at how you've been reduced by DEIA and trans rights, and immigrants are coming and taking your jobs. And you have to create that victim mentality. You have Christians in a nation that is predominantly Christian, where you have Christian holidays as national. That's maybe only one, but they're the only group that has a national holiday, federal holiday that is one of their religious holidays, Christmas. You have these prayer breakfasts that presidents go to. They have the Easter egg hunts, celebrating Easter in a Christian tradition. You've had, every single president we've had, other than Donald Trump, has been a Christian. Ironically, everyone except Donald Trump. Donald Trump is very clearly an atheist. He doesn't believe in jack shit other than his own power and greatness. And he is definitely wrong in his religious beliefs there. But Christianity has such a advantage over other people. They have relative privilege in situations. Doesn't mean, when you talk about privilege, it is how society treats you. It's not something that you that you're getting actively. It's not something that, you need to be ashamed of, but it is something you have to be aware of, that you're getting some unfair advantage, even if that advantage isn't total. There's other forms of privilege that most Christians do not have. But they feel that they're victims. And so that is big in fascism, wherever you see it. where was I going with this? The victim narrative is what we're talking about here, and he's leaving out the victim part, just talking about the glory, and it all rolls into the irrationalism. It's creating this emotional state of things that just aren't true or aren't really relevant. The greatness of Rome, or the power of Rome is not at all relevant to what Italy should be today. It's what people who lived there 2,000 years earlier did, and created power for themselves. And we'll leave any discussion of right or wrong of any of that elsewhere. Let's go on. Where am I? 2246. I got a little bit more before I have to say.
The Roman Empire. In fact, during the Roman Empire, what were the senatorial class and quite a few historians saying? Well, they were saying things were better during the Republic, we should bring it back. So that's nothing new. It's something that politicians have been doing constantly to gain public support. And clearly, from a modern perspective, this being the key, if we look at Mussolini's values, of course, they're going to sound very conservative. But then again, these are the 40s. In a similar way, if we were to ask ourselves, what would Benito Mussolini think about, for example, minority rights or LGBTQ rights? Yeah, he's going to be anti-homosexuals. He's going to be opposed to anything that has to do with transgender. But that doesn't make him right-wing in the modern sense. It just makes him a person from his period.
Now, it's odd that this didn't come up when he accused Marx of racism. Why are the 1840s bound by modern sensibilities, but Mussolini in the 1940s gets a pass? By the way, Hitler's first book burnings were of LGBT books in the Institute of Sexology. And I'm looking right here. This is from the UK's Holocaust Museum. I'm not sure what the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust is. Day Trust gets one letter. Okay, that's nice. But it's talking about this is where it started. The first thing they went after was trans people. I mean, you talk about homosexuality, but you go read through this. They are specifically, it pioneered. The Institute was also achieved a global reputation for its pioneering work on transsexual understanding and calls for equality for homosexuals, transgender people, and women. And this isn't saying that women weren't people, but they forgot the Oxford comma. Always use that Oxford comma because it does change the meaning. I know what they mean, but they did just call women not people, which is not what they were trying to do. But that is, of course, the first target there. And it is very big. And you got to keep in mind, a lot of this has to do with the concept of masculinity. And the fascist masculinity is extremely fragile. It's toxic masculinity. And Metatron, here's where you're going to learn something about toxic masculinity. It's not saying all masculinity is toxic. It is when it goes to a point of being toxic that it's overblown, where it's fragile, where it comes down to having to dominate everyone, having to beat up women because you're going to demand sex from them. It's about when you have hate of other people because you're all policing one another's masculinity. Are you masculine enough? Oh, you're really a woman, blah, blah, blah. And fascism, even though I wouldn't call it a defining characteristic, it would fall under elitism, but you have a very sexist notion in fascism, as it has presented thus far. I'm not sure whether or not it could present without it, but it's very important that you have this fragile masculinity and you're going to attack everyone, homosexuals. Oh, if you grew up when I did, you grew up in the 80s and 90s, you know how people saw homosexuals as, oh, these homosexual men as feminine, homosexual women as masculine because of who they were attracted to. The idea of somebody who's born with a male body, changing it because internally they're not male. That is threatening to this toxic masculinity. And so you get a very toxic form of masculinity here that is stoked by fascism. Once again, not all masculinity is toxic. There is such thing as toxic femininity, where it goes way too feminine, be way too passive, and not being the least bit assertive type thing. Being, you're looking at a lot of those super negative traits being amplified with that. It doesn't generally pose the same problem as toxic masculinity societally. It's more damaging to oneself. But, toxic masculinity is a big part of fascism, and that's sort of breezed over here by saying, oh, it was the times. No, he would have still been. You did have a lot of homosexuals in Germany's SA, and they were all killed in the Night of the Long Knives, because Germany had to have their toxic masculinity as they had it. Though the SA was still pretty toxically masculine, in their focus that male prowess is the only thing, and they tied their homosexual. I don't know exactly the specifics. If it was just that there was a whole bunch of homosexuals in it, or if it was actually part of the program, but it displayed itself for sure. Um, Homosexual toxic masculinity, and the SS said nope, goodbye, because they were useful at one point, but they were no longer useful, and so Hitler just got rid of them. And that is something to remember about it. If you're joining a fascist movement now, you can be disposable in the future. If you're not useful to the leader, goodbye. But it does seem that when it comes to Metatron, it seems to only matter if it makes him seem more left wing. And like I said, I think that's a subconscious bias he has that he's not willing to face. He's trying to separate himself as far as he can from these things because he's been called a fascist and a Nazi so much. And so he's putting out this slop as a psychological defense. And though I've never spoken to Metatron himself, I've seen enough of his videos. I feel comfortable. I don't, and you can condemn me for doing armchair psychology all you want. That's where I think it's coming from. And I'm going to say I'm entitled to my opinion there because I'm never going to be able to sit down with Metatron and psychoanalyze him. And, I'm not a psychologist to do it formally.
Because once again, the reason why I say this is not, yes, it sounds more like some elements of the right in America, but then again, you would have found the exact same type of opposition in communist USSR. You think Stalin would have been, oh yeah, a massive proponent of minority rights?
So now we're bringing up the Soviet Union, and there's some interesting stories with this. The Soviet Union under Stalin pushed racial equality as propaganda. There's no reason to believe he was true. He did have his own anti-Semitism and purges involving that and all that. Stalin was, he definitely, Soviet Union tended to treat people who were not Russian, including the Georgians, which Stalin was, but they treated them as second class. They went to a lot of the other I'm not even going to bring that up because I'm not 100% sure it's true. That was from a professor who in undergrad who I don't fully trust knew what he was talking about. So I'm going to leave that be. But you did have under Lenin, we did see the first modern legalization of homosexuality. Russia or Soviet Union was the first place where it was illegal to be homosexual, and it became legal. Lenin was, perfectly fine with that, not bothered by it. Stalin reversed it. He also called all homosexuals fascists. Very big thing. And you do have a lot of Stalinist groups. Even in America, we have the Revolutionary Communist Party, who nowadays is fine with homosexual people, but that started this century. I think it was like 2002 or 2003 that they went to celebrating homosexual lives, going immediately from previously that it was a bourgeois disease, a mental disease, and all that stuff. When you talk about Stalinist type people, they are not generally friendly to minority groups unless they see opportunity in it specifically. I like to say that Lenin and Trotsky perverted Marxism, but were earnest and meant well. Stalin was right-wing using left-wing imagery. There is a clear separation between Lenin and Trotsky, who at least tried to follow Marx, and try to say, okay, well, we need to follow these stages, and yeah, there's nothing wrong with homosexuals and all that. To Stalin, who's like, screw it, we have socialism. I don't care. I'm just going to call it that. When he was trained, Metatron mentioned that he was trained in the Orthodox Church in the whatever you call it. Back in the first video, one of the big things that he was trained in there was how to repeat things over and over until people believed it. Stalin, I like to refer to as proto-fascist as well. He had the nationalism. Soviet Union was very, very nationalist in the way that they actually operated. They're imperialist. They were definitely irrationalist, or at least, Stalin himself was definitely irrationalist in the very same way, the operational irrationalism. Elitism, I don't want to go one way or the other with, because there's elements where definitely there was some hierarchy in the Soviet Union that was beyond, people being elected to specific positions freely, and such. But they did have at least the message of equality for the people. Clearly, people at the top of the party had more, but I don't know how grotesque the wealth was. If I actually studied that in detail, I might be able to come up to a clear answer. But it's possibly might be able to call Stalin a fascist too, rather than saying communist. But of course, Orwell referred to him as a communist, differentiating that from democratic socialism, by which, when he originally said it, democratic was just the word that he used to describe socialism in contrast to communism, whereas communism he's using to refer to Stalinism. And later on just used democratic socialism to describe socialism. Before that, he just spoke of socialism. Apparently, people told him, I really like how that goes together, democratic socialism. He started using it, and that's what it meant until 2015. Bernie Sanders says he's a democratic socialist when he hadn't been one in 40 years. But Bernie's still a lot better than other options we have there. So don't get me wrong on that. Yeah, where are we?
And a supporter of LGBT. Well, no, and yet he's very far left, right? So as you can see, that's the problem when we overlap the present with the past. Things don't work that way. Therefore, such comparisons become futile. When it comes to foreign policy, Mussolini sought to expand Italy's influence and territories. This led to the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and, as we all know, an alliance with the Nazi during World War II. Both decisions that will be disastrous for Italian history. What about the idea of authoritarianism? Can that be defined as something either right-wing or left-wing?
Actually, yes. The Authoritarian Personality by Adorno, which I believe is an Italian guy. I don't know if he's born in Italy or not. Let's go here. I mean, T.W. Adorno, it doesn't tell me enough to tell me whether he was born in Italy or not. I don't know much about his personal life, but he wrote this great paper that you can see here. The authoritarian personality started it off. A person who took political psychology would know this landmark book. Whether they read it or not, I definitely read a lot of things that reference back to it. Authoritarian personality is a right-wing trait, along with distrust of outsiders, hierarchy, thinking in terms of fear, adherence to tradition, etc. It has been shown to be genetic. It plays a role in how human societies operate. We need people with right-wing genes and those with left-wing genes. You don't want just one or the other. We do different things. That between all the variety of things that human society can come across, you end up being able to survive because you have both these influences, which potentially can rise to the occasion at the right time. Not that they always do rise at the right time or in the right way, but they can. And a lot of the operational and rationalism that's done is focused on, even though it obviously wasn't known at the time that this is what they're doing, but they're getting those people with those right-wing genes and really manipulating them in particular because they're more susceptible to specific things. It's also fun that people with left-wing genes tend to sleep in later. They're the night owls. But authoritarianism is a right-wing trait. It has to do with hierarchy and following down that chain and making sure that you have order in society and types of things like that. It's big on that. Enforcing conformity is a big right-wing thing that's ingrained in there. And enforcing conformity has its purpose in moderation, as does accepting new ideas and incorporating them in. That is that left-wing gene. And you need both. They need to work in the right way. I am not 100% sure where I am. I know I am definitely left-wing. But I do have some things where I have been thinking more right wing, even if by comparison, when it affects me personally. In my 20s, I was really big that I wouldn't have sex unless I was in love. Uh, things like that. Who knows? I might have that right wing gene myself somewhat. It's not deterministic, but it does speak to certain things that you have going on inside yourself. And, majority of the time, you have big numbers, you multiply it up. People with the right wing gene are going to have right wing politics and vice versa, which is how they did. And if you're looking for this in literature, they're not going to call it that. They're going to call it the conservative gene, the liberal gene, because even political scientists sometimes are all too often blinded by a false American dichotomy that was around in like the 1950s, where you had liberals on the left, conservatives on the right, and even by the 1990s, that wasn't true anymore. American, moved to like basically all conservatives, and then kept moving to the right. And today, Republicans are fascist, Democrats are conservative. At least the establishment. People call themselves Democratic Socialists are liberals. We have our entire, we have things completely messed up in how we refer to things, because we don't understand ideology. We just go based on news media. Ooh, Democrats are interchangeable with liberal. Republicans are interchangeable with conservative. That's how we discuss it. And we lose sight of what these things actually refer to. But yes, you can say whether it is right wing or not. Yeah, go down. That's why I'll show a little bit. I don't know if it even matters. This is right at the beginning of the thing that has this and 4 other things. But yeah, sorry about that. Let's move on. And
Once again, it's one of those situations where no, it can't. Because if you look at all sorts of authoritarian regimes throughout history, whether they be far left, far right, however you want to call them, authoritarianism is something that occurs at the extreme ends of both sections of the political axis. Excuse me the term. Horseshoe effect does.
there are centrist authoritarians. There's centrist authoritarians too, Fun fact, here is a paper that finds the exact opposite. I'm not saying that it's simply correct, but it finds that extremes being less authoritarian here, that people on the ends are less authoritarian than centrists. Centrists are the most authoritarian. And this, of course, looking at American politics in the early 21st century. But it is something that you're making too much with this horseshoe stuff, Metatron. You bought into a heuristic that is fundamentally flawed.
End up in authoritarianism, particularly when individual rights and personal freedom and liberty are undermined. This is why hopefully this study in particular, in this video essay, can provide valuable lessons when it comes to the nature of power, the importance of anti-despotic safeguards, and the consequences of unchecked authoritarianism, which in my opinion are topics that are orders of magnitude more important and worth of study than just trying to decide, yeah, but are they left-wing or are they right-wing? Wouldn't you agree? Fascism clearly is a sort of third position, elements of the right and the left, but not strictly on either side.
No, that's what fascists say, not what those who study fascism say. The idea of neither being left nor right, like I said, that applies to conservatism, because conservatism doesn't have a set what should be. It's about the rate of change. A lot wherever it is, what is it conserving defines where it is on that left-right spectrum. But conservatism itself is fluid. It could be anywhere on. It's trying to maintain that status quo. Fascism is not that way. It is far right. It is as far right as I can conceive of. I am not sure exactly how you go more far right. Maybe if maybe you might consider it gets to a point where we do have all this automation and a dictator tries to kill everybody but himself. And so he is in charge of everything and has no one else, just robots and AI and all that to deal with. Maybe that would be more something that would be more right wing. I'd have to think about it, but fascism is really, really far right because it is the recreation of absolutist monarchy. I will stand by that all the way.
Once in power, Mussolini gradually dismantled democratic institutions. He suppressed opposition, pushed nationalistic propaganda, focused on traditional values while implementing corporatist economic policies. So we could say that fascisms are political movements that aim to take over the state, destroying classical liberal institutions like the independent media and individual rights. Fascists also make use of everything, and when talking about the media, of course, this connects to propaganda. Link in the description. The post-war period in Italy was characterized by economic hardship, social unrest, and political instability. Mussolini capitalized on these conditions, presenting fascism as a solution to Italy's problems. He promised to restore order, revive the economy, and return Italy to its former glory. His charismatic speeches and the militant actions of his black shirts gained him an unprecedented success. But
might be a good place to mention about restoring order. Law and order is a legal term that refers to the fascist and socialist systems, Nazi Germany um, and Soviet Union are what people tend to think of when they're bringing that up. And this is seems to be a relatively recent distinction in how people talk about it. But when people are talking law and order, these politicians are always talking about something different. And law and order is very arbitrary. It is my order. It applies when I say it does. It doesn't apply when I don't. Just because you follow the letter of the law doesn't mean you're not guilty. Just because you violated the letter of the law doesn't mean you are guilty. It depends on how the people in charge feel about you, what they want to happen to you. That's opposed to rule of law. Rule of law is a good thing. That's not arbitrary. That is, I know where the line is. I can go right up to that line and I'm safe. If I cross it, I'm fucked. That's simple. And this is something that we need to remember, especially now, because who's constantly talking about law and order? Who yells law and order in all caps with a bunch of exclamation marks? I'll let you figure that one out yourself.
regardless of that very success, Mussolini will be executed by a partisan at the end of the war after the Axis had been defeated by the Allies, and he will die having been shot by machine gun fire 9 times on his chest around his heart. One of the main problems that someone may have when trying to comprehend anything from the perspective of the past, distant or near, is the fact that we're all children of our time. Therefore, some concepts, expressions, and even events may be difficult to understand or to fully comprehend. So a great way to dig deeper into this without prejudice is to study the mind of those who were from that period and spoke about it. So today I've prepared a section from Benito Mussolini's own autobiography, written by him, and a section from the book he co-authored with another main fascist persona, Giovanni Gentile. Last but not least, one cannot talk about fascism without reading directly from Giuseppe Borghese. Let's go. Giuseppe Antonio Borghese is a very important writer, journalist, literary critic, poet. As you can see here, this is his page on Wikipedia. And among his works, there is one in particular that has a whole section on fascism that is, in my opinion, very apt and excellent at explaining the roots of fascism in Italy in context. It's called Goliath, the March of Fascism from 1937. He has a whole section on tyranny. It's a fantastic. Part 4 is very good, but I would like to focus now specifically on the following pages. Check this out. He writes, "It is now well known to everybody that the assumption according to which fascism came up as an emergency defense of Italy against an impending Bolshevik peril is not substantiated by facts, Then there is the part where he talks about, and he says, in Italy, in spite of an economic and social situation objectively more difficult than in France or elsewhere. And this is the part that I was talking about the economic conditions. Now, here's the crucial part. The scarlet phantom evoked and gigantized by the Italian fascists in search for a retrospective rationalization of their deed became easily popular wherever similar crimes needed similar exonerating circumstances. It was to be highly successful in Germany, and its automatic performances were, and still are, insistently rehearsed in France and in other countries as well. But if the Bolshevik peril, as vulgar opinion sees it, consisted of violence, tyranny, and infringement of the rights to the individual expression and free use of personal property, it is quite clear that fascism was the particular sort of Bolshevism allotted to Italy and later to Germany, and that only through fascism and Nazism did those features of oppression and subversion materialize in both countries.
Now, I do want to point out what you are addressing is likely revolutionary terror, given when this was written, 1937. The rules are not the same when you have a revolution. Things, especially when you're having a armed revolution, and when it's necessitated. There was no way they were going to peacefully bring about that change, no matter how many people were behind it, because they were overthrowing a monarchy. So you're going to have some sense of terror and people being told, you can't, having people, this. Originally, the first revolution was a socialist revolution. The Mensheviks, who were the actual majority, despite their name meaning the minority. They were actually, appropriating the lands and running them with, communal control. Soviet refers to a commune, actually, where they're working and the workers are having a say in how things are run and all that. That is going to seem a lot like this to the people who own these things beforehand and were employing these workers. There are, the people who, these aristocrats, whatnot, they would be the head. That's terror. And that's why I think about if it was a little bit later, I think it would have been, referring to Stalin, because Stalin did do a lot of things that could sound like that. But I don't think at this time he was referring to that. But it's also not very clear that he is referring to that. And I'm not reading the whole text here. It's not very clear that he is saying that these are actually things that have to do with what communism was doing. It's the popular conception, the vulgar conception, he says. So that wording makes me think maybe he wasn't actually saying that's what it was. Oh, you fear this, you actually brought it about with fascism. It was never going to happen with socialism and communism and blah, blah, blah. And so it's very important to keep that in mind. He seems to be cherry picking quotes right now because it's not very clear that's what the author was intending. And especially in academic text, you get stuff where things can be quoted misleadingly. There's a big text big thing that I saw going around where Bart Ehrman is, biblical scholar, an atheist, writing about, was Jesus real? And it's a paragraph that's actual paragraph from one of his books explaining, all these reasons why you would think, is Jesus really real? There's no physical evidence, blah, 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 blah. And people are posting it all over trying to say, see, this biblical scholar is saying that Jesus isn't real. It's from a book where the point of the book is that Jesus was a real person. So it's very, very misleadingly quoted. He's setting up the other side to tear it down, building a steel man. And that may be similar to what is being done here, where he's saying, well, you're fearing this, but boom, this is how it actually came about. This is how you actually saw it. I am not certain there. But the Soviet Union was authoritarian. And I do not recognize as socialist or leftist. It was a failed revolution fought in the feudal stage of development that Marx said was not ready for socialism. But a Western Revolution could pull it through. He did say that. Unfortunate words that led to Marxist Leninism. I explained earlier where it went from there. This also isn't definitional of fascism at all. Republicans like guns. Mao like guns. Republicans must be Maoist. See how it doesn't work out when you're trying to do this. This is a basic logical fallacy here. Just because two things have the same thing doesn't make them the same. It's a bad argument. It's not enough. These are not things that are definitive of either fascism or socialism, communism, etc. These are things that happened in the revolutions and in the I mean, there is definitely some terror in fascism. I mean, that's undeniable, but it's not a definitional to it. It's more of a secondary effect of these other things that are definitional. And so that's important to bring up.
See, change the colors, change a few policies, change the nomenclature, still the same kind of anti-freedom tyranny. Exactly my point. To be sure, several industrialists and bankers, but not all of them, helped Mussolini with advice and money. It may be accurate to contend that without the support of that section of capitalism, fascism would not have conquered the country. This is, however, not tantamount to saying that the rise of Mussolini and fascism can and must be explained as a merely economic happening, and that fascism must be described as an aggressive defense, a sally of besieged capitalism. If such explanation were apt, we should have seen and should see some sort of fascism wherever capitalism and property are menaced. Fascinating. Even those among the capitalists who joined and fed the fascist movement were inspired by passion far more than by interest. Now, this is pivotal. This is very important and a very good point. A lot of people, I want to argue, even today, they vote based on their emotions. I want to say the majority of voters vote with their guts. If you were to sit down and review every single policy proposed by all sorts of governments, some people that support one side might actually end up agreeing with the other more. But because it's very much of an appeal that politicians use to people's irrational aspects of their personality and their humanity, the emotional aspect of it, we do vote by passion as humans, and politicians knew it then, know it now. They had in 1922 nothing more to fear from a collapsed communism and a confused socialism. When he says confused socialism, of course, he's talking about the fact that the Socialist Party were pretty fragmented and had internal fights within them in period, whereas the right and the center right in this specific moment in Europe was a lot more solid, if you will. As for Mussolini himself, he did not want at all to become the tool of capitalism, as he had never wanted to become the tool of anything or anybody, nor even of France when he took her money in 1914. His plan was, and it always has been, to drive mad the passions of others, and, having deprived them of their intellectual independence, to make them the tools of his own passion. At
Operational irrationalism.
length, he managed to do so even with the Italian capitalists, who fondly fancied they had drafted him and his bravos for their purpose. They wanted to use him monetarily for some Saturnalia of revenge. He permanently subjugated them. That's the fascist control of the economy. Now he's leading the chain which they drag, looking around to see whether all the rest of the world would maybe like to be riveted along with them and to give a shared and comfortable feeling of unanimity and continuity. So that's the idea, as I was talking about the shift between the early kind of pro-capitalist, pro-free market aspect of the fascist movement and how it eventually became, by this time, of course, a totalitarian control of the economy, not capitalistic, not free market. Neither did Mussolini acquire the mentality of an Agnelli or Pirelli or a Rockefeller or Ford, nor had or have those capitalists and non-owners the mentality and purposes of a movement.
Henry Ford was an influence on Hitler and praised Hitler, though that was mainly anti-Semitism. But look at the Wall Street Putsch. That included a Rockefeller. They wanted to overthrow FDR and institute fascism. He is writing too early to see the full picture here. 1937, he doesn't know what those connections are. But let me stress that while it wasn't liberal capitalism, fascism tried to institute feudal capitalism through corporatism. That's what we saw described there when we looked at the full quote. And I don't think he was cutting, I don't think Metatron was dishonestly cutting it. I think he didn't understand it. Because this is not what he's trained in. This is not what his team of experts are trained in. So he didn't see the deeper discussion that that has to do with what corporate. Actually, no, that was Pollock that we had to cut. Though that was referring to corporatism, wasn't expressly referring to corporatism. I was implicitly doing that. But you saw the definition of corporatism there. I don't think Metatron knows that part of it. I don't think he's being intellectually dishonest. I think he's ignorant of that particular issue there. And I'm noticing sometimes I'm speaking to people who are not Metatron specifically, sometimes speaking to Metatron specifically. It's weird, but you're going to have to deal with that. That is the move. It's to the right, not the left. This is feudalism, neo-feudalism, created from capitalism that they're instituting. It's not socialism. Just because you have the state in control is not enough to be socialism. Socialism requires collective ownership and collective control. You cannot have collective control without democracy. And when we're talking that collective control, generally we're not even talking about just people electing representatives who issue down policies. We're talking a lot about what you generally see, workplace democracy, where people are the actual workers are voting on how they're going to operate things on day-to-day basis. If you ask me, there's some parts that should be handled from the top and some things handled from the bottom, depending on what it is, what you produce, how much you're producing. That stuff should be from the top, but how you're actually running the workplace and who is doing what job and what the break schedule is and whatever rules that you need to do at the actual workplace, that's something you're going to do at the lower level, and you got to work out exactly what goes where. There's so many ways that you could see socialism instituted, but they all involve collective ownership and collective control. You have private ownership and state, but a private state's control. This is Benito Mussolini's control, not the people. This is not democracy. This is not socialism. Socialism is very different. And you want to talk about nuances. These are the nuances that you need to understand. You hear that mantra. These are the nuances. What is the difference between state control under a monarchical system and state control under a democratic system. That's the nuance that matters. Not that, oh, but they had big government. That's not a nuance. That's a superficial look at something without nuance.
Mussolini. Brilliantly said. Last but not least, noble ones, to any who has followed me and reached this part of the, thank you for that, for watching so much. I think the best way to conclude this discussion that we've had about fascism being left wing, right wing, is really in the words of Gary Lodi, open quotes. When the government's boot is on your throat, whether it is a left foot or a right foot is of no consequence. Thank you for watching.
Okay. And let's stop this sharing. Back big picture of me. Now, what I want to stress here, what Metatron put out is slop, and it got a lot more likes than it should have, because people don't realize that it's slop. He has a good understanding of history. The history part is great, but he's not answering a historical question. He's answering a political question, even if it happens in a historical context. It's a political question. Are they left or are they right? And he does not have the tools at hand to do it. And as I said in the beginning of the first video, I think this comes from when he decided he needs to do it daily. That's getting him more views, that's giving him growth, it's giving him more money so he can help support his family. I get the clear impression that his wife doesn't work, and that's why she brings him food while he's streaming and all that. That is the traditional family structure that is important to Metatron. He doesn't force it on others. I assume he didn't force it on his wife. I don't know. But at least as far as I've seen her when she appears, she seems very, very content and all that. I don't think she's being forced into anything. That's what she chose, and it's perfectly fine if you choose that for yourself. That's feminism. You can choose for yourself whether it's you want to work or you want to stay home, and it could be the other way around. Metatron can decide he's going to stay home and take care of her while she works. It's not the way he did it because he has his thing. But that led to him putting out essentially slop, and he needs to be more focused on correcting this type of thing. I would probably suggest Metatron stay away from the political questions themselves. If you do, you want to hire somebody who's an expert with political science in the areas that you're dealing with. They're going to need to lead you through that kind of stuff so that you know these actual nuances. But I don't think that's the best. I think there is an expert that you really need, and I don't think it's that one. I think you can just avoid that content. You need somebody who is specialized in sociology. And that's not discussing what we were dealing with here. It is what I see the flaws when you come across experts in historical fields who you think are pushing politics. And sometimes you're right. Sometimes they are pushing politics. Sometimes you point out good contradictions where they are doing things I pointed out you did here. And they're probably doing it subconsciously, just like I believe you're doing it subconsciously. You know whether or not you are consciously doing it or not. I don't believe you were. I don't imagine you're going to come out and say, no, I was doing it consciously. So I think we're settled there. But sometimes they do have very legitimate things that come from sociology. Concepts that you think are pushing politics that really aren't. And I think you need to get yourself a left-wing sociologist in particular. You say you have a wide variety of political views and religious views and all that amongst your field of experts, but I think a left-wing sociologist in particular will counter um, your impulse to see everything as just politically motivated, and can give you a better view. And what you come out to in the middle there, after you discuss it and have it out with them, is most likely to be something that is neutral. You are pushing politics without realizing you're pushing politics, because it's very, very hard not to, and you're always going to push politics in some way. It's about being subtle and being open about where your biases are. And you're generally good, but you bring up Christian stuff. You're very good at bringing up your bias as a Christian. Um, but as long as you want to be open, this is what it is. You're going to have you're going to always have some pushing of politics in some way. And you do it too. You don't realize you do it, but you do it too. Um, and so I would focus on doing that. That is where you need another expert, because you've been calling way too many valid experts frauds and dismissing them because you don't understand the sociological context that they're bringing in, because they had some training in that. I don't know if that's something that comes through history programs now, or if they also took sociology classes before going into history. There, I'm a little bit lost. So where exactly it comes from, but that's what they're bringing in. They're bringing in sociology, and you need to understand those ideas. You need to understand what feminism is. You need to understand what woke is, especially because that's historical. That goes back more than a century. It's not something that's brand new. Woke has a meaning. It goes back to the black communities in like the 1920s and 30s. That just means being aware of systemic oppression. You're aware of where you are not welcome. You're aware of how you may be disadvantaged. That's what woke means. And it expanded since then to describe other forms of disadvantages that people have. Um, and you want to understand this in a lot, because there's a lot of nuance in it. And you don't want to be, outright. Some people take it way too far. There are people say that only white people can be racist because they don't understand what's going on. I think I discussed that. I not 100% sure if I did or didn't in the first video. Um, but there's people who think that only men can be sexist and all that, but you want to understand the concepts of privilege, of institutional bigotry versus private bigotry. These are things that are going to help you, could help you grow as a creator, as a scholar. I would strongly suggest you bring something like that on the team to help lead you in the right direction. That person's obviously not me. I'm not a sociologist, but that's the type of person that you want. And that's where you should focus on adding to your team. Because they're going to be able to set you straight when you're jumping the gun, attacking an expert because you think it's pushing politics when it's not. But politics ultimately affect everything, which is why you're always pushing something little, because it has to do with human relations, how we deal with one another. It's about more or less anything social, but not to the extent of sociology. Um, and I'm losing my own train of thought. It's been a long day so far. But that's where you want folks. Get your sociologists. They're going to help you produce better content and stay away from the direct politics questions, unless you want to get a political scientist in your list of experts, because you can look through. You failed miserably on this because you lacked the understanding that you needed to make a good argument, to fully understand the situation. And a lot of that does seem to be you psychologically being defensive, because you want to make it so that you distance yourself from it. Because I mean, it's clear you reject those actual things. I don't think this is a dishonest thing like a Tim Pool trying to pretend that you're not when you are. I think that you really do not like fascism. You do not like Nazism. And so you want to separate yourself from it, but you did it sloppily, um, because you weren't aware of how things were going, and because you didn't know things at the deep enough level. You really were grabbing at straws, bringing in superficial things, and letting it shine. Like you brought up whether Hitler was Christian or not, without any real explanation as to why it really spoke to this is you trying to psychologically distance yourself, because your Christian identity is very important to you. It's very clear through, in your videos. And so you want to separate Hitler from Christianity because you want to separate him from yourself. But you have to understand that just because you're slightly on the right doesn't mean that because the Nazis are far right, you're going to bring it yourself. And because at least you portray yourself somewhat as centrist. So I perceive you as center right. If you're saying that he's neither left nor right, it actually brings him closer to you. So stick with where the facts are. He is far right, very, very far right. But thank you, everyone who listened. Have a good day.